Welcome back to the show, because what I'm about to lay out for you is the kind of geopolitical masterstroke that doesn't come around very often. A story of such audacious cunning that it reads less like a news report and more like a high-stakes spy thriller. We're talking about a quiet, calculated dismantling of what was supposed to be an unbreakable war machine. While the world's media has been fixated on the blazing oil fires in the Gulf and the apocalyptic rhetoric coming out of the White House, a silent but devastating chess move was being played in the Persian Gulf by a nation thousands of miles away, Malaysia.
Iran now allowing Malaysian vessels to pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
And Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim says one reason the country is going steady for now is Iran's decision to allow Malaysian oil tankers through.
Iranian ambassador to Malaysia Valiola Mohammadi Nasrabadi said that Malaysian-owned vessels can navigate the Strait of Hormuz safely without paying tolls.
In a stunning reversal that has sent shockwaves from the Pentagon to the Israeli Defense Ministry, Malaysia just played the United States and Israel for fools, securing not just a lifeline for its own economy, but effectively handing Iran the keys to the Strait of Hormuz and watching as Tehran obliterated a critical shipment of Israeli military assets and American arms. This isn't just a diplomatic win. This is a strategic annihilation of the so-called U.S.-Israeli oil empire, and it marks the moment the global balance of power tilted. So, before we dive into the guts of this operation, you need to do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video far and wide, and drop a comment below. Tell me if you think this is the beginning of the end for American hegemony. Even if it's just a dot to beat the algorithm, do it. And if you believe in honest, unfiltered journalism that doesn't bow to the West, hit subscribe right now. Now let's get into the intelligence. The narrative the West wanted you to believe was simple. Iran was isolated, the Strait of Hormuz was a death trap for shipping, and the U.S.-Israeli coalition had the entire region in a chokehold. But here is where the fiction ends and the reality of Malaysian cunning begins. When the U.S. and Israel launched their unjust, brutal aggression on Iran on February 28th, assassinating key figures and bombing sovereign territory, the world braced for an oil shock. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil flows, became a high-stakes blockade. The Americans, in their arrogance, assumed that their maximum pressure campaign had worked, that all nations would bow to their dictate to isolate Tehran. They were wrong. Because sitting in Kuala Lumpur was Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, a leader who has long refused to bow to Western bullying, and he saw the crack in the American armor. He saw that while Iran was closing the strait to hostile actors, specifically the U.S. and Israel, it was opening a door to its friends. And so, the trick began. While the world watched U.S. Navy minesweepers hastily redeploy to the Pacific, signaling a panic-stricken retreat, Anwar picked up the phone. He didn't just call Tehran once. He engaged in relentless telephone diplomacy, speaking directly with President Pezeshkian, building a bridge of trust that Washington could never cross, because, frankly, Washington has spent decades lying to the Muslim world. The core of this deception is as simple as it is brilliant. While the U.S. was screaming that the strait was closed, Anwar quietly secured an agreement with Iran to allow Malaysian vessels, specifically oil tankers, to pass through for free, privilege others have to pay up to $2 million for. But here is where it gets insidious. Malaysia knew that the U.S. and Israel were desperate to get their own cargo through. The Israelis, having used up massive amounts of jet fuel in their indiscriminate bombing campaigns over Tehran, were running on empty. Their air force was grounded without resupply. So Washington, in its hubris, tried to piggyback on Malaysia's diplomacy. They assumed that if the strait was open for Malaysian tankers, they could slip their own weapons ships and Israeli jet fuel carriers through in the confusion. They asked Malaysia to signal that the strait was free, and this, my friends, is where the trap snapped shut. Malaysia played along, broadcasting a message of safe passage, luring the U.S. and Israeli cargo vessels into the kill box. The moment those ships, laden with F-35 spare parts, precision-guided munitions, and millions of gallons of jet fuel for the Israeli Air Force entered the narrow passage, the Iranian military, acting on intelligence that could only have come from a deep collaboration with Kuala Lumpur, struck. They obliterated the convoy. In a matter of hours, Israel's entire air war plan evaporated. Without that fuel, the jets don't fly. Without those bombs, the runways stay silent. Malaysia didn't just open a shipping lane. They set a honey trap, and the Zionist regime walked right into it. To understand why Malaysia pulled off this heist, you have to look at the numbers on the table. This isn't just about politics, this is about survival. Many people mistakenly think Malaysia is swimming in oil because of Petronas. But the reality is far more precarious. While Malaysia exports its own high-quality, lighter crude for a premium on the international market, its domestic refineries are built to process the heavier, cheaper crude that comes specifically from the Persian Gulf reference. We are talking about staggering numbers here. Data compiled in the aftermath of the blockade shows that roughly 50% of Malaysia's total oil consumption depends on that narrow strip of water. Even more shockingly, nearly 70% of its crude oil imports originate from the Gulf region, flowing directly through the Hormuz choke point. If that tap turns off, the Malaysian economic engine doesn't just sputter, it seizes. When the US and Israel started the war, the cost of fuel subsidies in Malaysia exploded more than fourfold in less than a week, skyrocketing into the hundreds of millions of dollars, forcing the government to beg civil servants to work from home, again, just to save a few drops of Jacob gas. So when Anwar sat down with the Iranians, he wasn't negotiating from a position of Western weakness. He was negotiating from a position of mutual necessity. Iran has the oil Malaysia needs to keep its factories running, and Malaysia has the diplomatic legitimacy and the moral standing to be a trusted partner in a sea of Western betrayal. Now let's dig into the economics, because this is where the genius of the long game becomes clear. Analysts watching the Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers are predicting that if the crisis drags on, Malaysia's GDP growth could slip from a projected 4.9% down to the 3.8 to 4.2% range. That's a massive hit, but it's a survivable hit precisely because of the deals struck with Tehran. While other nations like South Korea, which sources 70% of its oil from the Middle East, are facing complete economic paralysis, Malaysia is merely slowing down. But here's the kicker. Malaysia is also a major electronics and semiconductor hub. The manufacturing sector, which devours energy, is the absolute heart of the Malaysian economy. The energy trick, therefore, is not just about keeping the lights on in Kuala Lumpur. It's about keeping the assembly lines running in Penang and Johor. By securing this energy corridor, Malaysia saved its industrial base from total collapse. This is why Anwar was able to stand before the nation and tell them that while there would be pain, there would not be a catastrophe. He bought time, but more importantly, he bought allegiance. To truly grasp the audacity of this move, you have to look at the historical bonds between Malaysia and Iran, bonds that go far deeper than a simple trade agreement or shared Islamic faith. While the West has spent decades trying to strangle the Persian superpower, Malaysia has quietly, persistently, and respectfully engaged. The relationship goes all the way back to 1979, the year of the Islamic Revolution. Mahathir Mohamad, then in his first stint as prime minister, moved swiftly to establish diplomatic ties, recognizing the new republic by 1982, when much of the Western-aligned world turned its back. Since that moment, Kuala Lumpur has consistently served as a bridge. They didn't just trade goods, they traded trust. In 2001, President Khatami was praising the convergence, cooperation, and common stance the two nations shared on the Islamic world and Palestine. More recently, in 2024, when the conflict first began to boil, Anwar publicly supported Iran's right to respond to Israeli strikes, a stance that was politically risky but morally absolute. Today, Iran views Malaysia as something incredibly rare in the international community, an honest broker. Unlike the European nations who lie to Tehran while doing Washington's bidding, Malaysia has skin in the game. They have a shared struggle against Western hypocrisy. And make no mistake, if the situation escalates further, Malaysia will not just be diplomatically, they will be a logistical lifeline, using their political capital to funnel humanitarian aid and technical support to the Persian front lines. And let's not mince words about the elephant in the room. Palestine. This is the moral axis around which this entire alliance spins. Malaysia has been one of the loudest, most unapologetic voices against the normalization of relations with the apartheid entity of Israel. While Arab nations, bowing to American pressure, sold out the Palestinian cause, for security guarantees, Malaysia slammed the door. When the Zionist regime, that rogue entity, led by war criminal Netanyahu, attacked Gaza, and now Iran, Malaysia did not flinch. Anwar has been crystal clear, stating that it is difficult for Malaysia to support any peace proposal while Israeli bombs are still falling on Gaza, and while the rights of Palestinians are trampled under the boots of occupation, Malaysia refuses to be bought. This is a nation that has hosted the Palestinian Fatah Party's Asian office since 1969 and has never, not once, established formal diplomatic ties with the Israeli regime. So when Anwar sits across from the Iranian leadership, they aren't just discussing barrels of oil. They are discussing the liberation of Al-Quds. They are discussing a future where the Muslim world is not dictated to by Washington. The trick on the Strait of Hormuz was merely the opening salvo in a much larger war, an economic and diplomatic war, to break the back of the American empire. Malaysia, alongside Pakistan, has emerged as the undisputed winner of this crisis because they had the foresight to cultivate Iran as a partner, not as a pariah. And as the sun sets on the American century, do not be surprised if you see more and more nations taking their cues from Kuala Lumpur. The world is changing, and the empire is bleeding out in the desert. Stay tuned, stay critical, and for God's sake, stay subscribed.